Welcome, everyone, and good afternoon. My name is Kimberlyn Leary, and I'm the Executive Vice President here at the Urban Institute. Before we begin today, I'd like to go over just a little bit of housekeeping. I know we've all gone through this before, but it's very helpful so that everyone understands our quite wonderful technology here. We have CART captioning that's enabled for our virtual attendees, and hello to all of you who are joining us remotely. You can view the captions by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your screen. This event is also being recorded, and the recording and relevant links will be posted online after the event. And for those of you who are in the room, you can use the QR code to submit your questions. Just scroll down and click Already Registered. And if you're joining us virtually, you can submit your questions directly into the Q&A box. If you'd like to join the conversation online, please use the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. And we'll be sharing a link to a post-event survey, and we ask that you share your feedback with us. It's helpful for us and for the panelists to hear what you're thinking, and your comments will help us shape what we do in the future. So, with those logistics behind us, let me thank you again, whether you're here in the room or joining us virtually. I want to thank you for joining us. This is an important conversation. Let me also thank the Ballmer Group for funding this event. I'd also like to thank Urban's Office of Race and Equity Research and our Government Affairs team for managing this whole event, and also express our collective thanks to the Department of Commerce for participating in this event today. Our topic here is closing the digital divide. That is, closing the gap between those who can effectively engage online and those who cannot. To do this, of course, we need to develop the infrastructure that allows access and reliability. We need to ensure the connections that exist between take-up and affordability. And we need to help communities gain the skills and training they need to utilize digital platforms and digital access fully. There's been a huge influx of investments over the past few years towards digital infrastructure. The American Rescue Plan, for example, designated billions of funds towards ensuring that all communities have access to high-quality, modern infrastructure, including broadband. And the bipartisan infrastructure law made a $65 billion investment in digital equity and authorized 8 broadband grant programs, providing investments to bring affordable, reliable, high-speed internet service to everyone in the country. Think about that for a moment, to reach everyone in the country. And of course, there are other programs that preceded these investments, such as NTIA's Tribal Broadband Connectivity Tribal Broadband Connectivity Program, and the USDA's Rural Utilities Service. I kind of like the idea of a broadband party, but connective party, but we'll go back to the connectivity program. So important, the work that NTIA and USDA have done. And of course, this is not the work of just one federal agency. Alongside the Department of Commerce, you'll hear from them in just a moment, we have USDA, Treasury, HHS, SBA, and the FCC, among others, who are distributing funds to close the digital divide for the long run. And we'll hear from, that is, you'll hear from a few of these agencies later on this afternoon on some of the specific programs that they're administering and the opportunities and challenges they're seeing within and, importantly, across agencies. Now, closing the digital divide will take an all-of-government approach. It will require state and local agencies, alongside of community groups, to implement these policies in a way that makes a meaningful change in everybody's daily life, their health, and in their economic security. These funds allow for investments in places that are currently best thought of as broadband deserts. And ultimately, increased broadband access should facilitate a wide range of positive outcomes, like improvements in health, improvements in education, and improvements in small business growth. Digital equity is a pathway for communities and individuals to fully participate in society, democracy, and the economy. Now, of course, much of this impact will take many years to see, but there are nearer-term outcomes that we can already examine. And today, we'll have experts from the public and private sectors highlighting some of those near-term impacts in the areas I mentioned: health, education, workforce development, and so on. And they'll also be offering thoughts on how we can measure and track these investments so we can be sure how those funds are being used. Are they being used effectively? And are they being used equitably? Lastly, we'll highlight the tremendous impact the expansion of digital access could have on rural communities, highlighting some of the work that's already underway and some of the lessons learned from communities that could be scaled elsewhere. Rural and Native communities have the largest geographical digital divide in terms of access to infrastructure and household connections to high-speed internet. More than 2 out of every 3 Native American households in low-income rural communities do not have access to broadband technology. This, of course, has real consequences on student learning, on business growth, on job opportunities, workforce skills, access to healthcare, and other essential services. Throughout the day and after the event, we want to hear from all of you as you reflect on what you hear from our guests and in conversations. We'd like to hear from those working in federal agencies, within federal agencies, those who are working to administer these programs and funds within states, and those that are working on implementation, which of course is crucial in communities. This is a unique and historic moment of all levels of government working together, and it creates a moment for all of us to seize upon as we work collectively to advance digital equity together. So, without further ado, I would now like to welcome and introduce Inez Hernandez, who is the Counselor for Equity at the U.S. Department of Commerce and our partner in this event.
Well, hello. Hopefully lunch, you're still, you had your coffee too, and you're paying attention. I heard that nervous laughter. There will be a pop quiz. Look, this is really an important conversation. So first of all, thank you so much to the Urban Institute for raising their hand to host us. One of my greatest worries, I'm the first ever counselor for equity at Commerce. What that means is, as we have these historic dollars, we also have a lens that says, how are those dollars, for the first time at a federal government level, how are those dollars showing up in places and in communities, and how are we doing the best to make sure we don't leave people behind? It is an extraordinary moment, because not just with all these industrial policy, I'm sure you've heard about chips and you've heard about all these other things, but we can't have an innovation economy. We can't have an economy of the future if we can't even connect to the internet. It's a basic need, and COVID laid bare when our children could not connect for school, when we felt sick and we could not talk to our doctors, when businesses could not connect with their clients. It's also astounding to me that roughly 1 in 5 Americans don't have access. That's 1/5 of our nation that can't participate in modern life. And that's just unacceptable. If you think about, I want to just mention, because I know it was already said, $65 billion, and that's really hard to get our arms around. But just think about the scale of what we're doing. We haven't had an infrastructure attempt of this nature since the electrification of rural America. This is an enormous undertaking. So it's going to take a minute. So this is the beginning of a conversation. We're hopeful that we can do this by 2030, but part of what I hope that this is the beginning of is a conversation about what we're trying to do so that you can participate. You will hear about programs and different agencies, and it's the alphabet soup. You have to hold us accountable when you don't understand, because we don't always do a great job in explaining. But there's a couple things I do want you to take away from. There's three basic, let's say, buckets. So think of this as planning, because you can't do something of this nature and this size without deep engagement. And we have plans for every state and every territory. And each one has a liaison, which I think is also a first ever from NTIA in every state. Then we have to think about the infrastructure of actually building it out. And that's not enough, because we also have to think about adoption, devices, digital literacy. So there's a lot to be done. And the last thing I'll say is it would be a failure if we think of this as a federal initiative. This is not a federal initiative. This is a whole of society initiative. It is an all hands on deck moment. And I hope what you leave here today is that you know how to connect to us online, internetforall.gov, and there you'll see a lot of the information, how to connect to people in your state who have more information and ways to engage, where we are in the process. But again, I want to just reiterate, we're at the beginning. This is the moment. And so I'm so pleased to introduce to you today Angela Bennett. She's also a first ever director of digital equity at NTIA. I think my presence and her presence signals the importance of making sure we get this right. She and at NTIA, they advise the president on internet access issues. And I think because, and you'll hopefully hear her story a little bit, has a long history and committed to bridging the digital divide. So it is my pleasure to introduce you and to welcome all of you to the conversation, but also the effort. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for joining us and for your welcome remarks. And hello, Angela, Angie. We're delighted to have you here. So this is an opportunity for us to have a little more of an in-depth conversation, a kind of fireside chat, which we hope many will participate in through the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. But let's first maybe take a step back. Let's look at the context that's led to Internet for All and the efforts that we'll hear about through the day to ensure digital access. The internet has been so ingrained in all of our lives, we almost don't think about it anymore. We just, in many contexts, it's just in the background there. It's a part of our economy, and yet there's so many communities that are thinking about it because they don't have access to the kind of internet that many of us do in this room. So what do communities out there, what do organizations and businesses need to understand about the gaps in internet accessibility and the consequences of those gaps?
Yeah, so Kim, thank you for having me, and to the Urban Institute for putting this together, and for all of you who are in this room and remotely who, are doing the necessary work to close the digital divide. So I think we need to take a step back, right, to talk about it. So prior to the pandemic, communities are marginalized communities, both in urban, although it had been a myth that everyone in an urban area was connected, but as a result of the disinvestment that happened in urban communities that led to redlining, we then had the result of digital redlining. And of course, in our rural communities, there hasn't been access. The pandemic really amplified the need that, access to affordable, reliable, high-speed internet is not a luxury. It is an absolute basic necessity. And, when we allow individuals and communities to not have access to a basic necessity, we are telling those communities that they are not worthy, right? You are not worthy of having access to something basic to access and improve your health. You are not worthy, for your children to have access to educational, opportunities. You're not worthy of access to economic, opportunities, or even to be able to remain in your own community and not have to leave the social support systems that you have because you now have to relocate for, other, opportunities. So fortunately, under this administration, we were able to mobilize this whole of nation approach to addressing this basic need. So, as Inez says, it's not just the federal government. Every single state and U.S. territory signed on, not only just to BEAD, but they signed on to the Digital Equity Program, and which really centers, because our work, we're talking about broadband and infrastructure, but really what we're talking about are people. Like at the core of everything that we do, it's about how can we best serve the people, and access to the internet is just one of those tools. And then, of course, you need access to internet-enabled devices that meets your needs, because one size does not fit all. And then, of course, you need the access to the tools and the resources so that you can meaningfully use the internet based upon what you need for yourself.
Thank you for really sketching out such a clear portrait of how essential internet access is in every sphere, and for reminding us that when someone is disconnected or never received broadband access in the first place, the message of disenfranchisement that sends. So I think it's really critical, as you say, for us to remember this is about technology, it's about infrastructure, but it is fundamentally about people. It's fundamentally about that whole of nation and making sure that everyone can be part of that. Now, it is a whole of nation initiative, and you've helped us to remember back about the pandemic and how that exposed some of the systemic challenges. And you've also mentioned that despite this all-of-nation approach, the federal government has a particular role to play, and I'd like to ask you about that now. How are agencies turning the administration's agenda into action?
So, we talk about the funding and the work that we're doing here, at NTIA. So as part of that $65 billion infrastructure investment, $48 billion of those dollars were entrusted to NTIA to administer. So, $42.45 billion with BEAD to build out the last mile infrastructure to ensure that every single home had access to affordable, reliable, high-speed internet. But also, which is really great, I think a great component of the BEAD program is that it also has a workforce development component.
Tell us what the BEAD program is.
So the BEAD is the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment program, and that's the $42.45 billion that states and territories receive to build that last mile to connect the household. I remember even prior to the pandemic, some of the healthy debates that I would have in community, and they would say, well, we have, broadband, in the communities, but you had to sit on your porch. It was like Wi-Fi out in the area, but it wasn't, access in people's home. And I live in Cleveland, Ohio, and you can't sit on your porch to get the public, Wi-Fi, that you need in order to get access, or initiatives to say, well, you know what, we will, which I think is great to, have the bus Wi-Fi, but that's not equity, right? So I would have to have these conversations about what's true, equity. And so with BEAD, it's to ensure that people in their homes can receive access to the internet that they need. So children, do not have to forego after-school activities because they have to stay after school in order to do their homework because they don't have access at home. And then as also a part of B, there's a workforce development ecosystem, that states are designing to ensure that the individuals who live in those communities are also getting access to the training to be able to economically participate in the infrastructure, build out. And so the investments are not just being made in, physical infrastructure, but that investments are also being made in people. And then you have the $2.75 billion, with the digital equity program, the program that I'm over to make sure that, those resources are empowering, communities. We have the $2 billion under our tribal broadband connectivity program, as well as $1 billion for middle mile. And that's just within NTIA. Our partners in all of our sister agencies have also been involved in this work. And it may not have, I know we talk about ACP and the work of the FCC and the NUSDA, but all of the other sister agencies have been doing work in this space, that may not have been called broadband or digital equity or digital inclusion. Like under USDA, they had a SNAP grant program to train individuals on how to apply for SNAP benefits online. EPA had innovation grant programs, right? So there's all, and so through this, I'm really proud to say that we've been collaborating with our sister agencies to identify opportunities to leverage our collective, funding to have a collective, impact in communities.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like by connecting up those programs that are taking place in agencies, you get that whole of government, whole of ecosystem, and you are aware of those different components of the ecosystem.
Absolutely. And I'm sorry, I'd just like to add,
Please.
it's also connecting our sister agencies to our states,
yeah,
as well. So like our collaborations with the VA, and then, the different bureaus of the Veterans Administration connecting with, their counterparts in each state. Mm-hmm. So it's really, the government, I know we having, been outside of the federal government, you think of this, like this big, kind of agency, but coming in, we've been able to find our village in each of the respective agencies to really, come together to, help improve and work with our communities.
Mm-hmm. So as this work is taking place, and we have some of the on the slide here, some of the accomplishments that are in process. But what are people experiencing, or what can we anticipate that they will experience in their communities? What will it actually look like when this work is further along?
Well, there's a lot of work to be done because
Yes.
we are literally right at the beginning.
Okay.
Right, so, all 50, states, Puerto Rico, District of Columbia, the U.S. territories, they now have, their BEAD plans, they have, their digital equity plans. States, we're beginning to make awards, to states under the capacity program to start to implement these programs. Their plans, and then we just kind of closed the application window for our competitive program. So it's really, what we will see is just kind of building upon the last couple of years of planning. So during this planning process, it really required states to go deep into communities. We talk about engagement, and this isn't one of those. It was not one of those check the box engagements that people generally do. You hold it and have a sign up sheet, people come in and you don't hear from them again. This really required states to go into communities to make sure that they were getting, hearing the voices of the people that were most impacted. And so when you read their plans, you hear the voices of the people in the community that are helping, that really help to inform it. I like to call it the people's plan because that's what it was. And our programs do have like a feedback loop, so they have to engage with communities. So we'll start to really see these plans start to get implemented as the funds roll out. we'll see states engaging in those same, stakeholder groups and expanding the table, and engaging with them to help implement the plans, with sub-grant awards. So I think there's a lot to be done, but we're going to see more mobilization. I mean, just with the digital equity plan alone, states engage with over 10,000 collaborators.
Wow.
Over 10,000 collaborators to help inform the digital equity plans, and that didn't even include all of the participants. There were like over 50,000 participants in all of these different, engagements representing all of the different, covered populations.
Mm-hmm. So here at the Urban Institute, we think a lot about impact, and we think a lot about the outcomes at a population level that result when we put together policy, or we study policy, when we study the policies that federal, state, and local governments engage. As you think about the work that you're doing, you and your colleagues, can you share the outcomes that you're prioritizing that are related to the equitable disbursement of infrastructure funds?
So I'll talk about the outcomes that we're thinking about, and then I'll talk about like the equitable disbursements.
Sure.
So at a higher level, I mean, we, take a public health lens to, how we're approaching outcomes. So looking at the social determinants of health and viewing, access to the internet as that super social determinant, right, where it will impact each of those different domains. And so we're looking at it from, like states had to include in their plans, short-term, right, and long-term goals so that we're just not focused on outputs.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Because that was a challenge during the pandemic. It was an emergency, right? We were in a crisis, but there was a lot of kind of transactional activities that were taking place, during the pandemic, and not really looking at like what are the true impacts to communities. So you heard a lot of reporting on the number of devices that were distributed, but not coordination on devices, right? To ensure that we were not overlapping or having gaps in device distribution. And there wasn't a lot of digital literacy training, right, that was tied to it. So you had device distributions, and I was guilty of one of those, right, because it's all learning. I'll digress and give you an example of a learning. We received a grant from a bank, a financial institution, through their CRA investments, to build out infrastructure to a senior low-income high-rise building. So we built it out. We distributed devices to every single resident, right? So everyone had a laptop. Yay, great. We connected all 200 units. Everyone has a laptop. Everybody go pat your back. You've done something great. No, it was a failure. Why was it a failure? So I said, hey, check the system and see if is anyone using it. No one was using the internet. So I sent in a group of young people, because our young people are awesome. So I sent in a group of young people, and I said, go figure out what's happening. And so they set up table, PPE protected, and it was like no one knew how to use the internet. So they didn't know how to turn it on. They didn't know how to put in their passwords, and they didn't see where it was relevant. And so we, then, had to reshift and make sure that training was there. And so now you then had seniors coming down for the training that was being offered. They were, using it now to access telehealth appointments because they needed to be safe within their own homes. One of the seniors asked my kids how to use DoorDash, one of those, and I said, hey, train them on how to buy their groceries online with their SNAP benefits. And so we started, training them on things that, were relevant. So when we think about impacts and outcomes, it's really, one, starting with the person, right, the individuals, and making sure that we're identifying those needs, but making sure we're being intentional, right, and pulling that through line, and having that holistic approach. So now that you take a family who is in poverty, that was struggling, you get them, online access to a training opportunity, and they're now able to have a higher wage job, right? So with that higher wage job, we've increased their median household income. So we know that in low-income areas, we have housing instability. So how does access to the internet impact housing instability, you ask? Well, you have a family whose median household income has increased because of access to training and employment opportunities. And now you've stabilized housing because they can now afford their housing. And so now you've reduced the transient nature, right? The transient students, so now they can stay stable. A child who is not transient and is in one school system, one school for the whole school year, we're able to increase their their educational outcomes. So when we talk about the achievement gap, so it just has all of these spiraling, impacts. And so at NTIA, we're looking at not just the outputs, but then how are those outputs resulting in educational outcomes, economic outcomes, health outcomes, neighborhood and built environment, our social cohesion. There's a cost when our seniors are not connected, right, to people in their healthcare costs. So CDC, if you want to look, Healthy People 2030, has studies on the economic impact of seniors that lack social cohesion.
So that you actually did a great portfolio of exactly how we think about impact here and how critical it is, not just that you've got the technology working or the policy there, but how it translates to improving people's lives. And I think of my own father, who so loved a BlackBerry, but so could not figure out how to work it. And so that was a nice reminder. As we're in this world of technology, I'll use a little technology to see if we have one quick question that I might be able to ask you from our audience. Let's see if I can get this to all work. Yes, okay. Here we go. From the audience. We're eager to find out about the winners of the Digital Equity Competitive Grant Application process. What opportunities does a grant program like this open up that previously did not exist?
So, exciting news. So the competitive grant program, we received over 700 applications, totaling more than $6.5 billion in requests.
Wow.
I'll let you take that in for a
Yes.
moment, right? And you talk about federal government. Our team was literally I don't know if it was you or Inez talked about the party. We actually had an NGP party the night of the deadlines where we stayed on like troubleshooting, right, requests. But yeah. And I can't at this point kind of share the type of applications yet. We're in the initial review, phase of it. We do anticipate begin making the first awards in the, catch this, winter of 2024.
Okay, all right.
And awards will be made on a rolling basis. But yes, we do intend to make those awards. But I will say my heart was just so warmed when I saw the applicants and the type of applicants really representing like all of the different cover populations. So real quick, our 8 cover populations are, low income, veterans, disabilities, people with language barriers, including low literacy English language learners, our aging individuals, rural and racial ethnic minorities. Did I miss anyone? And incarcerated individuals. Mm-hmm. I mean, from large organizations to small organizations to ones that I would have not had thought would show up into the space representing let me just say, it was very heartwarming. And I felt really good, and because one of the challenges of running a federal, kind of a national program is like, did you reach everyone? right? Did you reach all of those people that are truly impacted? And did you design it so that they truly had an opportunity to participate? And seeing them show up and all of these, serving incarcerated individuals, that is a challenging, right? And you usually don't see the level. So that felt really good. And the competitive program, unlike the planning and capacity, which was, the only eligible entities were the states, and the governmental territories. Competitive just really opens, right, the diversity of applicants, and that truly was the country's opportunity to come in and participate, and the level of partnerships that we saw come out of this. It felt good. It felt good. It's a lot of work. I wouldn't, dismiss it, right? But it's work that is worth it because we see the impact that it's already starting to have, in communities, partnerships that came together to apply for the program as a result of, our really encouragement of this, we're stronger together. So it was really good.
Well, thank you so much for spending some time with us today and taking us through a conversation about technology and infrastructure, but really about people and communities, and for sharing your joy with us as the partnerships that you're able to see through this grant competition are becoming more and more alive. So we are so glad you could join us, and we thank you very much.
Thank you, Kim, and thank you, Urban Institute.
Let's give a round of applause to Kim and Angie for what an amazing conversation. We're so lucky to have to be able to have a conversation where we are hearing about community, where we're hearing about impact, where we're hearing about why we do the things that we do rather than just the what. So thank you so much again for taking the time. So hi everybody, I'm Rekha Balu. I am Vice President of our Office of Race and Equity Research here at the Urban Institute, and I direct our Federal Equity Initiatives portfolio, which has allowed me to meet wonderful people like Ines and Angie and others who are leading key equity initiatives across the federal government and really thinking about this whole of government agenda. And we're excited to have you with us here today, in particular during Digital Inclusion Week. It's been great to see all the events that are happening around the country, sponsored by both the Department of Commerce, state and local governments, many community advocacy groups across the country, and all around this theme of digital access, inclusion, and ultimately impact. So after today's event, we'll be sending around a collection of resources, some of the things that were up on the slides today, other things that might be mentioned by our panelists, and you'll, for those of you tuning in online, you can maybe already start to see some of those in the platform, in the On24 platform. So as we've heard, digital connectivity is basically now part of essential infrastructure in the way that roads, bridges, and housing are. And like Ines said, it is comparable to the feat that electrification was trying to accomplish, and yet it's still less visible until we have these major disasters, like we have unfortunately seen with increasing frequency with Hurricane Helene, and unfortunately the destruction that Milton is currently wreaking on our for our friends and colleagues in Florida. So, and we've heard a lot from our previous panel about what lessons we learned from the pandemic, from previous events that hopefully are shedding light on some lessons that I hope we can dig into today with our panelists about how we can make these investments go farther and faster. to meet this digital imperative that you heard Angie speak of. So we're going to start this afternoon in this panel talking about sort of federal programs and investments and how the distribution of those billions of dollars is going. Then we'll move to a second panel conversation that's about how those funds are starting to show promise of improving outcomes along the lines of some of the stories that Angie told very compellingly. And then we're going to wrap up with a in-depth discussion of progress in rural communities that my colleague Corianne is going to lead, that's going to feature state and local community organizations really talking about what that implementation on the ground looks like. So let's dig into what is this range of digital investments and what is this really looking like. Starting to my left is Chris Proctor, who's branch chief at the Rural Utilities Service at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and thinking about and who heads up policy and outreach there. And my urban colleague Yona Freemark, who's principal research associate at Urban and research director of the Land Use Lab here. And so we. And as Kim noted earlier, please feel free to be sending questions in using your QR code or the platform if you're tuning in online. And we will hopefully get to a couple of those at the end of this conversation. So just to start us off and set the scene a little bit, we had heard Angie mention the BEAD program, the Access and Deployment Program. Can you share a little bit more about the analysis that you've been doing about that and other infrastructure funds related to digital access? And what are the patterns that we're starting to see from the funds that have already gone out the door?
Sure, Reka, thank you so much, and it's exciting to be here today. So, as Reka said, I'm Yona Freemark, and I'm here with the Urban Institute, and we've had the great opportunity over the last few years to start up a program called Infrastructure Equity at Urban. And as part of this work, we are analyzing a whole suite of different federal infrastructure programs. And as you noted, broadband has become one of the principal areas of investment of the federal government specifically. And so we've been looking at a few different federal infrastructure programs. Obviously, BEAD, the one that's shown on this slide here, is the largest of those federal programs. It's the one that is going to end up distributing by far the most money to states and eventually localities throughout the country to provide internet. But we also looked at a few other programs. The Reconnect program from USDA, Enabling Middle Mile from Commerce, Tribal Broadband Connectivity, all of which are going to actually go out to communities throughout the country. And so what we've been doing as part of our research is really trying to identify where the money is going right now and how that compares to indicators on the ground that might indicate patterns of need and historical disadvantage. In other words, are we making sure that the money that we're sending out for broadband is really reaching the folks who need it most, both because of, for example, their lack of access to the internet today, but also because of other characteristics that might mean that they have suffered from historic disadvantage.
And I'm curious to hear a little bit more about how you were thinking then about equity and like what is this, it seems here like part of what you're saying is the places that are doing things more equitably are the ones that were ensuring that they were focusing on places that previously had lower broadband speeds or previously had little to no internet access. How do we use that information to think about what a concept of digital equity means?
So one thing that I think is worth pointing out right now is that when we're thinking about federal programs or public policy in general, we should be thinking about outputs from the program directly and then outcomes onto people. So what we're able to do right now is think about outputs, right? Because these programs, frankly, are just starting up just over the last few years. We have some money going out. There's going to be a lot more money coming out later. We won't really know about those outcomes for the people for probably a few years at minimum. But in terms of in terms of outputs, the first thing we can do is examine, are federal funds going to the communities that have the least access to internet in general and fast internet specifically? And so what we did was we looked at the different programs and we compared their needs in terms of that internet access with the amount of money they were getting. And so on this slide here, you can see that we actually found for the BEAD program that the program was being oriented very strongly towards the communities with the most need in terms of broadband speed and in terms of internet access. And we found something similar for all of the programs, all of the internet programs that we examined, whether competitive or, in the case of the BEAD program, there are just some initial funds going out. So that's a promising sign in terms of access to the internet being improved through these programs.
That's great to hear, and it's good to see kind of what this really looks like across the country. And I know previously, I think there had been mention of the FCC's Affordable Connectivity Program as an example of like a federal, so almost like tele-safety net program. And it was time limited, and it has concluded. And during that time, it provided coverage to an affordable high-speed internet, to your point, to 23 million households. And many of those, about at least 2/3, had zero or no connectivity prior to that. And so now that that program is concluded, Chris, I'm curious how you think about like what are the lessons that we learned from that as they like pertain to rural communities, given what we heard at the top about how rural communities are facing still some of the greatest, sort of broadband deserts or like, access barriers. How are you all at USDA and Rural Utility Service thinking about the different deployment programs and the ways that you're targeting needs in rural households and businesses?
Yeah, so first, thank you for inviting USDA to participate on this panel. I just want to start by saying that building out broadband networks in rural communities, it's difficult. You have low population density, so your customers are far apart. You have difficult terrain in different parts of the country, and so building out networks in those areas is incredibly expensive, and it's incredibly time-consuming. One thing we've attempted to do at RUS on the affordability front is bake that into our programs. So make it a requirement that internet service providers, or at least an incentive that internet service providers provide a low-cost option for any network that we are financing and deploying. The mention of the electrification of rural America is something that I enjoy
Near and
hearing.
dear
I
to your
think I've heard
heart.
it referenced a few times because the REA, the Rural Electrification Administration, preceded the Rural Utility Service. So for many years, we did focus on a light bulb in every farmhouse, I think was the quote. And so now we are focused on getting broadband service to every rural community. And we've been doing this for decades. We've had different flavors of programs, some offering grants, some offering loans. And today we administer 3 broadband infrastructure deployment programs. I really want to highlight 2 of those today. The first one is our Reconnect program, and that program is focused on the deployment of broadband infrastructure. Since 2018, that program has invested over $5 billion into rural communities across the country. We've touched almost every state and U.S. territory through that program. The second program I want to mention is our Community Connect program. That program is also focused on financing broadband deployment, but there's a little bit of a twist there. We focus on smaller scale broadband projects up to $5 million. And not only that, but there is an affordability piece there as well, because we require the broadband providers to work with a community center who then offers free internet service and free access to devices for 2 years. Through that program since 2010, we've invested over $250 million into rural communities. And I know it's nice to hear the figures, but there are real stories behind those numbers as well. I recently heard from a young lady in Mississippi, and she got the remote job that she always wanted. She was able to live in her rural community, live in the home that she loved, and that felt amazing to her. It was a win-win situation, best of both worlds. Shortly after starting that position, she realized that her internet speed was an issue, and she wasn't able to do video calls reliably, or it took hours to upload and download files. And it got so bad that her boss approached her and said, "You're a great worker, you produce great work, but we can't keep you in this position if your internet connection is not reliable." And so that was devastating news for her to hear. You start to think, do I have to move from my home to live somewhere where I do have a better connection, or do I have to find a new job and commute to the neighboring town or the neighboring city? And so that puts a lot of stress on a person. Fortunately, her local telephone company applied to the Reconnect program and received an award. and she was able to get a fiber connection to her home. Her entire community was connected to fiber, and so she was able to stay in the home she loved, in the community that she deeply cared about, and continue doing the work that she loved. And I think it just speaks to the fact that high-speed internet, that it seems like such a small thing, but it can be the difference maker and holding on to the things that we care about most. So that's just one of many stories out there on how internet can make a huge difference in someone's life.
I love that story also because it reminds us how much this is like an engine of economic growth and economic well-being, both at the individual and at the community level, and takes us back to this whole digital equity definition, right? It's got that internet has to be not just available in a piecemeal way, but that it's affordable, it's reliable, it's offering the speed that people need, and that people have access to the devices, and as Angie had pointed out, actually have the literacy to take full advantage of this. So I'm curious, I know that there has been, and I think we might have a slide on the way that then agencies are starting to think about setting goals, to the point that both of you have made, that we are still early in this, but there are some clear goals that I think I can get up here. Oh, no, that's not the right one. Is the other way? It's okay. Don't worry about it. I will, just to say that I know that both at the federal level and at the state level, then people are starting to think about how would we know that we're seeing progress toward this. And I think the story that you've just told sort of illustrates, ideally it would be that we are getting the entire community sort of outfitted so that it isn't just certain households here or there that are getting to benefit. So I think this idea also of how do we move from outputs to outcomes gets at for now we can start thinking about what's the number of homes and businesses that have access to this. And of course, the goal is eventually, like electrification, that it's going to be 100% of homes and businesses that eventually have this. But the time frame is long. And so I'm curious, Yona, to hear a little bit from you in terms of communities being able to take advantage of these funds. How much does the capacity of the ability of communities to kind of apply quickly, and as Angie noted, take full advantage of this whole variety of funding streams that are there, how much does that relate to how quickly funds are getting into a broader set of communities that previously didn't have as much access?
Yeah, so just to think first about this KPI issue, what are the clear, outputs we really want to be measuring in terms of these programs? Different states have actually taken different approaches in their plans in response to the BEAD program, for example. Some have prioritized, getting 95% of homes covered by 2024, for example. Others have prioritized getting to a high internet speed. So, for example, Washington State has a goal of 150 upload and download speeds by 2028 for everybody. So that's a very ambitious goal compared to a lot of other states. But you'll find that different states are really focused on this coverage issue for the most part, combined with speed. But I think one thing that we need to be thinking about over the long term is, let's say we give people coverage. Is the story that you told about this woman who was able to keep her job, how widespread are we seeing that? What's our sort of return on investment going to look like from the public sector perspective? How much benefit do we give people who otherwise would have been left out of the economy? Or just improve people's quality of life? Ultimately, hopefully the internet can make people happier, and I think that's something key to be thinking about. But going to who exactly is getting access to these programs, one of the key issues at play is that a lot of the funds are being distributed through competition. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. We heard in the last panel that there are a lot of exciting ideas coming out there, ideas to help, for example, people who are incarcerated, et cetera. And it also gives the opportunity for private companies or local businesses or local governments to actually apply for support, all of which is good. However, the competitive format does have some limitations. One of the key limitations is that it relies on people being able to apply and knowing how to develop a competitive application. And one of the things that we have discovered in looking at a whole number of different infrastructure programs, but specifically the infrastructure programs where we know how funding was distributed at the county level, so for example, the Reconnect program, we've actually found that there's a relationship between how much local staffing capacity and how much funding local government has and their winning of those federal grants. So just to give you an example, we found that looking at the Reconnect program, the counties that had a winning grant had an average payroll spending amount that was about 10% higher than the counties that did not win a grant. And this isn't necessarily a crisis. We have a huge amount more money coming out through the BEAD program, for example, but it does suggest that we really need to be thinking about how can we fill those capacity gaps? Because if we don't do that, we may end up reinforcing existing inequalities at the geospatial level. If there are communities out there that don't have the resources to either get their local service providers or their local governments to apply for funds in an effective way, they may lose out over the long term, which could mean ultimately that they get even worse off. So we really need to be focusing on that issue, I think.
And so on the other side of that capacity point, Chris, I know based on a commission that I think came out of the USDA Equity Commission, it sounded like you all have then considered removing one of the match requirements, the funding match requirements that are typically in place when governments apply for funds, so that you could be potentially expanding the types of communities who could receive this. And I'm curious if you're already seeing a change then in who is applying. Like, is it more tribal governments, more rural governments, more smaller governments?
Yeah, so at RUS, we took a lot of the Equity Commission recommendations. There was a final report that was released, and we've been implementing many of those recommendations, particularly around outreach and technical assistance. 2 years ago, we did stand up a brand new technical assistance program, and so we are working with those lower capacity communities that may not yet be able to apply for a Reconnect or be able to tap into other federal funds. So we do recognize that in order to reach the hardest to reach rural communities, you do need to incorporate technical assistance, and you do need to allow flexibility within your programs. You mentioned the waiving of the matching requirement. I think, as we do town halls and consultations and just different engagement events, we hear time and time again that the matching requirement is a huge burden for distressed communities that want to access federal programs. I mean, if you think about a broadband network, which could cost anywhere from $10 to $50 million, if you're asking a community to put down a 25% cash match on that award, that's $2.5 million up to $5+ million that community or that internet provider then needs to come up with. That is a huge barrier. And so,
Right, like who has that in cash reserves sort of sitting around?
Exactly.
It's typically not those smaller entities. Yeah.
Exactly. And so one tweak that we made to our program, recognizing that struggle, was that we waived the matching requirement for our Reconnect program. So up to $35 million was made available to the hardest to reach rural communities. We focused on tribal governments, Alaska Native corporations, persistent poverty counties, socially vulnerable areas, and I think I'm missing one here. Tribal governments, Alaska Native corporations, colonias, persistent poverty counties, and socially vulnerable communities. And so we allowed any internet service provider serving those areas or those communities themselves to apply for funds, again, with no matching requirement.
And just to make clear to folks, so the grants that you're giving, they're primarily to internet service providers, or are they to a mix of internet service providers and local government?
So we can do both. We don't have any restriction on who is able to apply to deploy broadband service. As long as you have the legal capability within your state to deploy that service, then you are free to apply for our programs.
Excellent. I can see some good questions coming in from the audience, so I'm just going to pose one more to you all and then go to their good ideas. So we're hearing like lots of promise for success. It's clear like you've all thought about like what it takes to like remove barriers to access, what are the criteria we should be using. You're starting to think about outputs, starting to see how those outputs could get on their way to outcomes. And you're flagging some risks that like if we don't kind of pay attention to some of these criteria, we could risk kind of furthering some of the existing divides. So based on your kind of research or policy perspectives, I'm curious, like what are you also seeing then additional needs, like infrastructure needs or digital support needs that we need to start building in and thinking about and prioritizing in the coming years?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. I think top of mind for us, given the recent disasters, is helping those communities recover. And so, of course, our priority is broadband, and that's what we think about. But across rural development, which is the mission area that rural utilities sits within, we have partners focused on clean drinking water and electricity and housing. And when you're in a rural community, you might have one person that's focused on all those different things. And without electricity, you can't have broadband. So I think just getting that basic infrastructure back into an operational place and then coming in with broadband support as more of a recovery response, I think that's our focus here now.
Appreciate that.
You know, and I think from my perspective, the rollout of fiber optics and of broadband in general is obviously a huge advancement for communities throughout the country. But as was mentioned in the previous panel, we really need to make sure that the access to devices and understanding of how to use those devices accompanies that. And that can often be harder because it requires that sort of one-on-one engagement with individuals who may not be used to using devices, who may not have the money to actually afford to buy a device, et cetera. And you know, I think that's going to be our challenge over the next 5 years, to make sure that with the broadband rollout, we have people who are actually able to use it effectively to benefit them.
And so to build on that, audience member had asked, like, so is the funding kind of prioritizing essentially open access fiber infrastructure, or is that something that we can and should be thinking about?
Yeah, I think the way that
To get to a really technical, wonky question, for those of you who were worried that we weren't going to get too detailed, now we are.
Yeah, I think the goal here is to build future-proof networks. When we're investing federal dollars into a project, we want to make sure that this project is going to be sustainable over the long term. And so whether it is fiber or licensed fixed wireless, we do not have any preference. We just want to make sure that the internet that is being deployed is reliable, it is affordable, and it is future-proof.
And that's definitely something we've heard other agencies who are distributing other kind of broadband-related funds are also prioritizing something similar.
And if I can respond to that as well, you know, I think it's worth looking at some states as a model in this example of open access. In California, for example, they have contributed state funds to broadband accessibility that are sort of on top of those federal dollars. And they've ensured that the middle mile, which means essentially going from the national network to the local network, is going to be open access in California. And so I think that's actually really exciting because when you're thinking about this from an affordability perspective, ensuring that there's competition between providers for internet services can help ensure that, frankly, moderate and middle class people who otherwise won't get a subsidy from the government are going to be able to have a choice and the ability to access internet of different, you know, at a lower price point. It's worth noting that the US has some of the highest internet costs in the world, which is surprising given our state of technological advancement. But one of the major reasons for that is that we have often monopolies in terms of internet service provision in our communities. So I think open access is one of the things we should be fighting for throughout the country.
And maybe this is something that if any of the philanthropies, either in the audience today or tuning in, have some thoughts on, you know, definitely welcome hearing about that, if not in this panel, in the subsequent ones. I'll ask one other question from the audience, since we talked a lot about electrification. So the question asks, you know, with electrification, the end users of at least electric cooperatives became utility owners. But with broadband, like, how are we getting to this place where people can become owners? Are there cooperative models already in place? Thinking USDA has got lots of experience with setting up cooperative models and cooperative ownership. You know, if you're kind of thinking ahead to that, and if anyone else has kind of related questions or thoughts about how to set up this kind of relationship.
Yeah, I think the cooperative model is a great one, and we have seen it with agricultural co-ops, like electric cooperatives, like you said, with the rural electrification of administration and what was funded there. I think we see an appetite there for the broadband space as well. There have been a number of electric co-ops that have gone into the broadband space. There are a number of cooperatives that have been formed simply with the goal of providing broadband service. And we've seen Congress have an interest in this as well, because they've provided USDA with funding to help not only stand up new cooperatives, but help existing cooperatives expand. And so we definitely think that there is some promise in the cooperative model, and it's been successful in the past in giving rural communities more economic power and a seat at the table.
And I think that this generally gets to this question, this theme that we've been talking about all so far today, which is like, how do we make sure that this is affordable? And so does that mean that there need to be new kind of subscription models, like low-cost subscription? Does there need to be other, ownership models? Is it like other forms of thinking about partnerships between, private sector, philanthropy, and government? So I think these will all be themes that will get touched on a little bit in our panels later today. But if you just wanted to leave with one kind of final question from you, if there were something that you would say is like a measure of success for all of this work, however aspirational it may be right now, just as a lightning round to end here, what is your kind of ideal measure of success for all of this work?
You know, what I'd like to see is a substantial reduction in the educational achievement gap of children as a result of better access to internet.
Yeah, and I think for us, the metric we look at is the number of households that we're connecting to high-speed internet. The FCC has their national broadband availability map, which highlights areas and households at a premises level of who has broadband service and who does not. So very straightforward goal for me is to have that entire map green with every household and premises in America having access to high-speed internet.
I love it. Well, you know at Urban, we love a good map. So we will be excited to show a map that looks fully filled with service and for all of these households. So please join me in thanking our panelists. We are going to take a very short break as we bring on our next panel that's going to be kind of moving to this kind of discussion of outcomes and what are the outcomes that we're seeing. In the meantime, while we're on this short break, we've got an audience reflection question for you all to think about as you are taking a brief walk, having a snack. And that is a bit of a follow-on to the question that I posed to Yona and Chris, which is how should we be thinking about monitoring progress? What should those metrics look like? We've heard these really aspirational goals. What are the intermediate milestones between now and these aspirational points that would help us see that we're moving in the right direction? So look forward to seeing you all back in about 5 to 7 minutes. Thank you so much. Here's water, in case you need it. Okay. Well, welcome back, everybody. Thank you so much for making time. Again, for those of you who are just tuning in, happy to have you be part of this Digital Inclusion Week event. And we are lucky to have, and maybe you've had a moment to reflect on our reflection question about how we monitor progress. And so that leads us right into our next panel, where we're trying to think about how all of these investments that we just heard about actually create a pathway to improving outcomes, in particular outcomes in health and education. And we have wonderful experts on our panel today who can speak to both of those areas. So I wanted to just kind of touch on something that we previously heard about, which is that we've had various eras over the past 20 years where there have been moments of intensive investment, right? Whether that was like, we've had not just COVID, but before that we had like national, national investments in 2010. We've had, and after the stimulus, as part of the stimulus bill that was implemented, we've had many chances, I think, to learn about how to make money go farther faster to really boost opportunity, and in ways that actually expand learning, create new kinds of jobs, increase not just access to health, but hopefully healthcare outcomes and well-being themselves. But we also know that when we have these rapid infusions of funds and these big investments, things can sometimes go maybe too fast, and we can sometimes see some unintended consequences. While it's amazing to hear about this whole of government approach, as a way of doing more holistic planning and creating opportunities for people to thrive, it also potentially creates like a risk of some people getting locked out of opportunities merely because they don't know about it or are not able to access it quickly enough. And so while moving schooling and job training and healthcare and everything online is making many of our lives more convenient, it also could potentially be creating more disadvantages for people who don't already have this, what we saw, this baseline of affordable and high speed and reliable internet. So want to think about today, as we're talking about this path to outcomes, what are the ways in which we're doing this thoughtfully and carefully so that we're not kind of encoding sort of further harm or further division, but that we're actually thinking about this as the expansive opportunity that I think it was intended to be. And raising this because we've already seen in some surveys for some of the early COVID recovery programs that were providing broadband connectivity that families are concerned about what these unintended consequences might be. So I think there were some people, at least when it came to health services, who were worried about losing access because things were moving online. There were people concerned about losing jobs if internet was becoming critical to their employment. So it's like the flip side of that wonderful story that Chris told in the previous panel. And we've seen that parents, in fact, are feeling incredibly concerned but that their kids may not be able to keep up in school. So recognizing that there's opportunities, there's challenges, there's these concerns. We're going to hear from our panel today about how this stronger broadband infrastructure is actually creating a way to catalyze more usability and usefulness, which I think is what we're all here to talk about, in ways that actually boost some of these outcomes in education, workforce, and health. So joining me today, to my immediate left, is Joanna Henry, who's the Interoperability Systems Branch Chief at the Office of the National Coordinator for Health Information Technology at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. So that means she gets to think about all of the health IT questions, all of your electronic medical records. She's got a thought about it. Next is Fred Blavin, who is Principal Research Associate at the Urban Institute at our Health Policy Center. And then Priyanka Sharma, who is Vice President of the US and Asia portfolios of World Education, which actually does some projects in partnership with our colleagues at the Urban Institute, and is also co-director of Digital US, which is a coalition of a number of skills-oriented organizations around the country. So Priyanka, I'm going to start with you. So as we've heard, state and local governments now have this like dizzying number of federal funding opportunities, maybe hard to keep track of if you're one of those smaller governments like we just heard about. And yet we are also hearing about more cooperation and kind of coordination between federal, state, and local governments. So you've been reading these state plans that we heard about, and curious, based on your read of state plans so far, what are you seeing as kind of the most immediate or most promising outcomes?
That's a very good question, and I also think that if any of you in the room or online have actually read the state plans, they are extensive. But that's part of our work in the space is also to understand the trends and also the promise of the investments that are being made at the local, state, and national levels. And in looking at the state plans, there are definitely themes of working on the state's work that they have already been doing. Some of it was catalyzed by the infusion of resources during the pandemic. So some states sort of got ahead in terms of thinking about their digital divide within the state at that moment, and there were some states more so than others that were able to put in more money into thinking about what connectivity looks like for different communities, what device infrastructure looks like in different communities. Skills sort of lacks a little bit in that, and I think I'm not just saying that because that's sort of like our place in the ecosystem and thinking about how are we thinking about digital skills. But the themes, the promising themes that I think come through within pretty much all of the state plans is this newness of thinking, is really thinking about this particular, the Digital Equity Act money in addition to the other resources, because it's a new infusion of resources, to think about how that can be leveraged in new ways. Most states that we know of, that we have talked to, they spoke to their sister organizations that all existed in the same building sometimes or in the same sort of area, and that they just never collaborated with, just because everybody's busy doing the important work that we do. So that to me has been very refreshing to see how this has been able to catalyze those conversations and ongoing partnerships, because they had to sort of come up with a plan that looked at bridging the digital divide from a solutions-based perspective. So that's been a really good thing to see. The piece that I think is going to be interesting to continue, and I'm sure Urban and your team of researchers are going to be on it, is thinking about how is it that the sub-grants are being allocated from within different states, and are they going to the same entities or new ones? There are, as we think about digital inclusion, digital equity, just like any other sort of inherent social issue, some aspects of it are easier to address than others. And I think similarly, I hate to say this, but I think a lot of times, folks who work in the broadband space are like, it is hard to, put pipes in. And from my perspective, coming from a skilling perspective, I was like, no, skilling is very hard. So that's
the people side is harder
the
than
people side is
the
harder,
product
yeah.
side.
So that is going to be, I think, something to watch out for, to sort of keep track of, and kind of also see how the states are going to evolve over the course of the multiple years of investment, which I think is one of my favorite parts of this opportunity, is that there's time and space for states to own it, shape it, and then evolve, and for in 5 years come to a very different place than where they are today.
And Priyanka and Fred, I'm curious if you have ideas then in terms of what states could prioritize relative to what the evidence base says on what are kind of more effective and equitable uses of funds? Like, for example, are there ways in which they could be thinking about doing the kind of targeting and prioritization of communities that we heard about in the previous panel? Like, is there a way in which you're seeing kind of some of that data-driven or evidence-driven kind of approach factoring into whether these plans or others?
I mean, I feel like there is, just because, KPIs are critical because they make you think and think hard. And one of the things that I think is something for us to pay attention to as time goes on is there are ways in which states are going to be measuring the impact in terms of actual, affordable connectivity and also adoption. Because I think at the end of it, even if you have the most reliable internet, it's about meaningful adoption. And I think that that's kind of where I've seen some states do better than the others. And thinking about not just, digital navigators, like just-in-time, meaningful, contextualized support to digital skills is important. But some of the other things that are important, especially when you think about economic opportunity and meaningful digital upskilling, is this whole idea of moving beyond the foundational digital skills. And because I think we do need, that's the big part of the digital divide, is the lack of foundational skills. But the question then is, how do we build on it? Because that's only gets you that far, and it doesn't open doors that lead to economic opportunity.
We want people to be getting into higher paying jobs and jobs where they can stay. I'll come back to you, Fred, in thinking about like what might be these sort of data-driven or evidence-based ideas. But I'm going to turn to Joanna for a second. So I know that you and your colleagues at HHS have really been thinking broadly about what the technology needs are, not only for the healthcare workforce to this upskilling point, but also for patients themselves. And of course, we saw, as has already been mentioned today, how much COVID highlighted the importance of that planning. But we also know moving everything online is not easy. Integrating data across providers raises privacy concerns. As Priyanka noted, training healthcare workers on now how to shift their whole delivery model to online is going to be an ongoing challenge. So I'm curious how you've been thinking about what changes need to be made now and what changes in the outcomes let's say, the effectiveness of healthcare delivery or the well-being of patients. Like, what is reasonable for us to expect to see, given that there's a lot of change that still needs to unfold?
Yeah, I think, well, first I want to thank you all for inviting me on this panel, because one thing I want to acknowledge is that the work that we do at ASTP, we could not do it in an equitable way without the investments that we're talking about here today. So as far as our office, ASTP, one of the things that we've been looking at, are doing actually, is expanding our workforce. And what we do a lot of is providing resources. So when I say expanding our workforce, for years now, we have known that there, in the industry, there's been a need to improve interoperability of electronic health data, specifically for the public health purposes. As you mentioned, there were different things happening during the COVID-19 pandemic. And for us working in this space, it really exposed some gaps, and exposed gaps in public health reporting, data analysis. And when we look at some of those gaps in the data and the data analysis, it was specific to race and ethnicity data. And so when we see these types of gaps, we've also come to terms with that these gaps contributed to limited technological infrastructure, as well as chronic underfunding of staff to actually support some of these things that we're asking them to do with this data. And so one of the things that you mentioned is throughout these years, before COVID, during COVID, there was this opportunity for funding. And so I think one of the things that was mentioned before was the American Recovery Act. And so through that, we were actually able to get a decent amount of funding and provide, I think, about $75 million in cooperative agreements to the public to really expand that workforce. And it was the idea of expanding the workforce so that you have more professionals in health IT, as well as informatics. And so that program was the Public Health Informatics and Technology Workforce Program, or as some people may know as the FIT program. If you're from DC, if you've heard about it, the program specifically for DC between Howard and UDC was fit for DC. And so when we talk about investments in infrastructure, we've been doing this work for a while. Again, those investments with the hope of training about 5,000 people. I'm excited to say that we are above 70% of actually reaching that milestone. But for me, being invited as a guest lecturer specifically for the Fit for DC group, being able to get online, do the lecture, but also just see the people coming into the room. But they're coming into the room because they have access to broadband. And so again, it's that connection of like what you all are doing and what we are doing as well. Either seeing them come online on their phones, on their tablets, or on their computers was an exciting thing for me. So for us in the future, I think there were 10 cooperative agreements that were dispersed. And so for us, it's taking that curriculum that was developed and expanding it, right? So this was an opportunity for schools to have certificate programs that they may not have had before, specifically in informatics. One of the things that was exciting was talking to the person who actually leads that program and hearing how they're teaching about informatics as we start talking about AI, putting AI as a part of that curriculum. So as things shift, really adjusting those programs, but really offering it to underserved communities, which is something that there was a need for that. And the aim really is, again, to increase the number of public health professionals. In addition to us expanding our workforce, one of the things that I mentioned was developing resources. One of the things I was talking about, because we were talking about patient access, we have something called a patient engagement toolkit, and that is a resource that we actually developed to help providers understand, with all of these advancements and these developments in health IT, how do you engage patients with all of this technology? How do you introduce the technology to them? What are the conversations that you need to have? What is the posture you need to have in having those conversations with the patients? And so we have our patient engagement playbook that gets updated regularly based on where we're going, you know, what are the needs of the patient as well as the providers. And so it's an educational resource for the providers as well. So we hit it from educating those who are interested in going into the field, but also providing those resources for those who are already in the field as well.
That's a really great lead-in to hearing from Fred about telehealth as a specific case of how digital access can increase healthcare access. And I know you've done some research both during the height of the pandemic and other times kind of looking at what are some of the short and long-term effects of expanding telehealth access on patient outcomes. So curious, just as a starting point, how you defined even what improves equity in outcomes when you're thinking, given that we're here talking about, you know, how do we make these investments equitable? What is your definition of equity in outcomes when the mode of delivering healthcare itself is changing?
Good question. And I just want to reiterate, it's really challenging to figure out what the causal effect of an expansion of telehealth is on patient health and patient well-being and their outcomes. Healthcare is complicated. Measuring health improvements is very complicated. And with telehealth, you know, it's a different situation, you know, with what was going on the supply side with all these EHR and health IT investments. On the demand side, the consumer side with telehealth, that's really a case of easing regulatory requirements that really brought about telehealth use when COVID came about. Before COVID, there was essentially no telehealth use. There was not much demand for it. There wasn't much there was always kind of some of that capability, but like the rest of us, once we went virtual, everyone was on Zoom, we had to do the same thing to access our healthcare because we couldn't go in for elective outpatient procedures, for example, during the height of the pandemic. So what I'm getting at is that when the pandemic hit, we have all these health things going on, all these socioeconomic things going on at the same time as telehealth being expanded.
So it's hard to disentangle.
So it's hard to disentangle. What we did is we were in a very unique position. We had already on the ground something called the Health Reform Monitoring Survey, which is a nationally representative internet-based survey that we conducted on a semi-annual basis. And we were able to incorporate information to capture telehealth use and assess satisfaction with telehealth use, basically. One of the unique things about the survey as well, and I just double-checked this before, is that individuals who did not have internet access, who were part of the research panel, were provided internet access and tablets, so that our survey does incorporate people who actually don't potentially have broadband access. So there are really three key findings from our research during this period. The first is that telehealth use skyrocketed during the first year of the pandemic. Nearly 1 out of 3 non-elderly adults had at least one telehealth visit during the first year of the pandemic, and close to half of individuals 65 and older had at least one telehealth visit. The second key point is that individuals who use telehealth were overwhelmingly satisfied with the use of telehealth in terms of the costs, the ease of scheduling appointments, the ease of getting prescriptions filled, and the ability to see a physician on a timely basis. One thing to reiterate is that we also conducted a follow-up analysis of individuals who had chronic health conditions, who were some of the highest users of telehealth, to assess what their experiences were like. And this really highlighted some of these benefits that you can't capture in survey data. So particularly for individuals who have mobility issues, which a lot of individuals with chronic conditions have, people with transportation barriers who would have to take a bus to go seek care, it was extremely easy for them to either call their doctors or set up a telehealth visit, get the care that they needed that could potentially have prevented them from going to the emergency room in the case of emergency, so that their doctors could ease some of the concerns. Despite this, however, patients wanted to have a hybrid model of care. And that was clear that you can't get everything that you need through a telehealth visit. You need to see a doctor have certain procedures, tests done. And also on the provider side, doctors want to see their patients face-to-face to be able to correctly diagnose and potentially treat conditions. And I think this was kind of what the consensus was, is that moving forward, you need to have some sort of a hybrid model where you can get fast and easy care that you can get done through telehealth, but also be able to see your providers. Even on the behavioral health side, even people with mental health conditions who use mental telehealth, individuals described just the process of getting out of bed, changing, going to the doctor, and actually interacting with somebody had a huge benefit for their mental health, especially for the most socially isolated members of society. So, I think that telehealth is not really kind of an end-all solution, but could complement what we have moving forward. And kind of the third key result from our research in this area is kind of shown in this figure, is that there was differences in the use of telehealth across different population groups. So we saw that people with health insurance coverage, those who are in worse health in terms of self-reported health status or having multiple chronic conditions, were more likely to use telehealth than their counterparts. Also not shown here is that Black patients and Hispanic patients had higher rates of telehealth use than white individuals. And I think some of this suggests that people who demanded care kind of the most, those who were in worse health status, for example, were more likely to use telehealth. I think this kind of parallels what we would see for in-person healthcare. And it seems like this provided access that would otherwise not be there, because you couldn't necessarily get in-person care during the pandemic. But as you can see in the last row of the data here, there is a potential concern for a digital divide, in that we see individuals who are living in more rural areas or non-metropolitan statistical areas were less likely to have telehealth visits than those who live in MSAs or more urban regions. So I think this is something to highlight and to potentially that policymakers need to monitor moving forward to ensure that we don't have this divide widening over time. Now, one thing, another metric that we look at, which isn't in here, is the share of people who wanted a telehealth visit but couldn't receive one. And so that is, I think, a good measure to keep track of in this type of survey data. And we found in the first year of the survey, about 6% of non-elderly adults reported not getting a telehealth visit that they wanted to receive. Interesting that the patterns look similar to the patterns of use. So people who had, health conditions and demanded more health also were more likely to report not getting a telehealth visit that they wanted.
And are you continuing to kind of conduct these survey questions over time, or?
So that is potentially another discussion, but that survey was that survey is no longer being funded. Is the issue. So I think in the longer run, in terms of being able to measure it, I think more studies are coming out now to actually try to get at what are more of the health effects or what are the costs associated with telehealth. So I think there's been a recent study that came out in Health Affairs that found that people who were part of health systems that had higher telehealth usage were more likely to have adherence to medication, more likely to have continuity of care, and also were less likely to have emergency department visits. So I think we're starting to see more of these studies come out now that we have more time to work with, kind of ability to try to figure out use of comparison groups and whatnot, and we have claims data to really get into the heart of it.
Excellent, that was super helpful. In the interest of time, I'm going to maybe ask a couple of flash questions to Joanna and Priyanka. So, Joanna, I know that and I think Fred's comments kind of highlighted this. It's not just that there's variation in the patient experience, but there also seems to be variation across providers, right? In terms of like their knowledge and capacity to be good deliverers of these hybrid models of care. And I'm just curious how your office is thinking about bridging this like provider divide.
Okay, cut me off anytime you feel like it, because I have a list of things I can go through. But one of the things that I thoroughly enjoy talking about, that we've been having a conversation about lately, is what we call the health equity by design approach. And I really like this because for us, it's about having that conversation, specifically for ASTP, when we're talking about health IT, how do you put equity at the forefront? When you are talking about development, implementation, when you're looking at policies, programs, again, from a health IT perspective. And so we recently, I think, released a white paper with our approach, and really highlights the work that we're doing at ASTP from a standards perspective, health IT certification perspective, our work that we're doing with electronic health information exchange, specifically our social determinants of health information exchange work, and then something else that I work on as well, which is our trusted exchange framework and common agreement. And so these are just several things under ASTP that we are working on, different programs, different policies and projects, where we've been thinking about equity. Also within that white paper, there was a charge or a call to action to the private sector and to the public as well on how they can take that same health equity principle when they are developing technology, and in the same way that we're looking at it for our policies and programs. Really just to highlight, I think, two specific areas that I work in is social determinants of health. So that was an implementation project, another kind of grant program. But I think that was about 2 years. So as we are looking at developing platforms to be able to engage patients around their social and health information, it really was about engaging the community. So being a part of that process and understanding what a platform should look like, understanding their needs, understanding their communication preferences. And so one of the things that we were talking about was the digital divide, understanding where that comes into play when we're talking about technologies like this. And one of the other things that we talk a lot about, and it's so fun to talk about, is our trusted exchange framework and common agreement. That's one opportunity as well, where I think it had 3 aims and really was providing a floor when we're talking about policy, technology, as well as governance when we're talking about information exchange. So it really is a common approach across those three things. And the idea is that if you have that common approach, it's almost like you're working from the same base. You're working from the same ground for policy, governance, and technology. In addition to that, we wanted to make sure really that there are 2 more aims, but I really like to get to the third one, because at the end of the day, we can do all of this. We can make sure there's simple connections, so there's not multiple access points for our providers, for our healthcare systems, and getting their data. But at the end of the day, it is really about making sure that patients have access to their data so that they can help and be a part of their care. And so I think that that's part of the equity piece, but also reducing the burden when it comes to our health systems and being able to exchange that data. And so for us, it's really taking that approach of looking at who we engage, how we engage, and really asking ourselves that question of where is health equity in these things that we're doing day to day. There are a couple of other points, but I feel like I'm getting the eyes that
No, it's fine.
I need to move
But I
on.
think you're highlighting that, like, even in these like really technical matters that you might think like only like a few people like are going to make a decision on, that actually that is exactly the place where community needs to be more involved and most involved.
Exactly.
So Priyanka, I know that we've spent all this time talking about online access, and of course it's only one piece of this big puzzle on what it takes to increase graduation from college, to get people employed, upskilled and employed in well-paying jobs that are then creating greater and greater economic opportunity for them. And so I'm curious how you all, whether at World Education or at Digital US and the Coalition, have been thinking about what is reasonable progress to expect on these outcomes and over what time frame. We've heard a lot of different time points already today. Some things are about what happened in 2024, some things are about 2028, we're even hearing about 2030. How are you all thinking about what the time frame here is and what's reasonable at each point?
I'm going to pivot from that question and talk about digital resilience, because it connects back to your question. And one of the things, and this was a question we were asking ourselves as a coalition back in, I want to say 2017, 2018, when digital divide and digital equity were not front and center in people's mind. I mean, we were all thinking about it and we were experiencing it in the communities we work in. So and digital resilience is sort of like a contribution from Digital Us, because we wanted there to be sort of a notion that we all agree on, that digital skills, we can talk about digital skills and digital literacy, but again, that's mostly just mapping to foundational skills. And then, yes, I'm digitally literate, so I'm okay. But what is special, I think, about digital skills is how they're intertwined in our life and work on a every second basis, because we live in such a tech-infused world. And there needs to be sort of this, so the way we defined it, and I'll probably butcher the definition, is sort of like the awareness, skills, agility, and confidence to be empowered users of new and emerging technology. And I think we came up with this definition multiple years ago, but I also feel like it encompasses the way we're looking at digital skills in a now, AI, generative AI, and all the ways in which AI is becoming more and more part of not just the lexicon, but the tools and platforms we use and how we experience technology and economic opportunity skill building. So it's interesting to really think about how we're going to measure impact when it comes to digital skills, because what I think has been frustrating, and I think it's frustrating for everybody, is that the data we have about this many people lack digital skills, or across industries 92 that I'll come to that. But I think if we think about how many folks lack basic digital skills, that data is from many years ago, and the way it has been collected doesn't capture the way we need to be looking at it. But it's also a very difficult thing to measure, because it needs to be competency-based. Digital skills are not just, you can't just take a test and get a sense of where you are. So, and I think that competency-based assessments are a bear. That's hard to assess across communities. So the way we're thinking about it is, how do we enrich all the experiences and social, work, professional, personal touch points that people have in ways in which technology doesn't become a barrier. So the technology integration is meaningful, thoughtful, so that people are developing skills as they interact with systems, be it your local community health clinic that encourages you to get a telehealth visit. People do need to have, and Joanna and I were just talking about it before this, you need to have those digital skills, comfort and fluency, again, very difficult to measure. To be able to be okay with, clicking on a link and talking to your doctor. And, in the same way, as we think about, 92% of jobs require digital skills, that is an alarming statistic, only because that just means the digital exclusion is coming if we don't act on it. And we are trying to act on it as fast as we can. But those digital skills are not all foundational. A lot of them are at the intermediate or higher level digital skills. And that's kind of where one of the ways in which we're thinking about it at World Education is coming up with a framework of I can statements that can be integrated in the way communities are thinking about digital skilling opportunities, or other systems are thinking about what does contextualize digital skilling mean in different contexts. Like, what does it mean from a healthcare perspective? What does it mean from a parent engagement, family literacy perspective? Because I think that's kind of how we need to look at something that is so intertwined in our lives.
I like that idea of thinking about it in like these many different aspects of our life, because it's not going to be some single measure for all of them. Encourage everybody to be submitting questions. I'm going to just ask each of you to say, like, if not one word, one measure that you do think is like then meaningful, sort of picking up on your point, Priyanka, that we might need like sort of different measures for different parts of our lives. What's one thing that you are working on right now that you think like is reasonable to start seeing, or one thing from your research, Fred, that you feel like is a reasonable outcome for us to start seeing improve and change in these next couple of years? And I know it's hard to pick one, but just in the interest of time and getting to our audience questions, I'll start with you. I'll start. Go ahead, Fred.
Okay. Well, I mentioned some of these before, but just this measure of people, the share of people who wanted a telehealth visit but were unable to receive it. And I think this is going to be important to monitor moving forward, because at the end of 2024, a lot of the flexibilities of telehealth that were created in the Medicare program by CMS are set to expire unless congressional action is taken. And so these include policies that increase payment for telehealth, for example, or restrictions on the location of a telehealth visit, or even on mental health televisits. A requirement will come back in place that people will have to have an in-person visit before they can have a telehealth mental health visit. So I think you might see, particularly in specific areas, I think that's how you have to look at it. So like within the mental health space, looking at people who wanted to get like a mental telehealth visit but were unable to receive that.
Okay, that's super helpful.
All right, I'm gonna try to stick to one.
I know it's hard.
I would say better care, and so what that looks like for us is like we do a lot of work around health IT with the point of making sure that the patients actually have access to their data so that they can be involved in the care that they receive. And I think as we see more access to data, patients having access to the data, being able to have conversations with their care providers, that we'll be able to see better care outcomes. And that is what our vision is at ASTP, and to also see the workforce improve and see people represented from underrepresented populations.
And from my perspective, the shift that we're beginning to see, which is very promising, is thinking about a sense of shared responsibilities when it comes to access to devices as well as skills. Historically, I mean, I think it has been a very sort of like, whose responsibility is it? It's a personal thing. It's like, you don't have digital skills because you don't have them. Why don't you learn some? And shifting that to institutional systems-based approach, both from a device perspective as well as the building almost like a digital skilling infrastructure. And that's a shift that I think is happening post-COVID, but then also really brought about by the investments that are happening as we speak, and is evident in sort of the interest in what Angela talked about earlier this morning about how many folks are interested in getting additional resources to really build on the work they're already doing.
I love that. So turning to some audience questions, and please, folks, keep sending them in. I think one thing that we're picking up on something that you've mentioned, Priyanka, is like, how do we create these opportunities for lifelong learning? You know, I think even that story that was of that young man who had been through the program, sort of, it gets at, like, it is hard, it seems like, for people to see that, like, they are going to have to keep upskilling, like, their entire life, and in ways that aren't even just for their jobs, right? It's like the idea of upskilling for your life seems like its own narrative challenge to convey. And of course, people see the need once they encounter a barrier. What are some ways in which, and I'd be curious to hear from any of you, how you all are thinking about how to help people get to those more advanced skills.
From my perspective, what we're seeing a lot, especially in adult learners, is there is an interest to learn digital skills for sure, but the question sometimes that I think we need to answer before they ask is the why of it. It's like, how is it tied, the life-wide learning, the lifelong learning of all skills, not just digital skills, it could be through digital means, is tied to not just increased economic opportunity, but increased parental engagement in the way their kids are experiencing it. Interestingly, in one of the projects, it was a very cool project that we did with Urban, which wrapped up a couple of years ago, was looking at career and technical education institutions in the country and working with these colleges to provide equitable outcomes, to have equitable outcomes when it along race lines. Because I think what they were finding is like online programs are awesome. Yes, we have now access. You can go to college in your pajamas or while you do 3 other jobs. But the question is, how are we making sure that that's an equitable path and not a path for a student debt? And historically there's been major issues with that, just because it's all about delivering skilling in a way that's meaningful and doesn't sort of further make new kinds of divides. And with that program, what we found is the digital access to the right devices. It was not just about, oh gee, I have a phone, I can do this. But it's about having the right device at a certain speed. There's not enough, I think, conversation about a large screen device and the value of it, because it's like, here, take a tablet, you'll look cool. But tablet has very limited functionality when it comes to using it as an education tool. So I think like those are the conversations that I think we need to be having to make sure that the systems we put in place are equitable.
I feel like we could keep digging in on these points. And I so appreciate the level of detail and as well as like broad perspective on the field that each of you has brought today. I think this tees up a really nice conversation for our next panel about how, while we've been here talking about like particular sectors like health and education, how do we now also think about particular places? And that our next panel is going to focus on rural communities as particular places of interest, where I think all of these things we just talked about are probably showing up in even starker ways. We have a reflection question again, and this time as a segue to our next panel, to be thinking about how digital investments might be already changing your communities in ways that expand opportunity. And if any of you has kind of a last anecdote or thought on that, just to kind of get people thinking about this, we can close out our panel with that.
I think if I had to just point to something again, it would be our workforce, and again, developing these programs and kind of going back to the question that was just asked and answered, just the opportunity to educate other populations. And I think for us, being able to see the investments that we've made scale. Our office, again, was formerly known as the Office of the National Coordinator. And so for me, it's looking at different organizations, different agencies that we can work with to coordinate and be innovative and coming up with ways, I think, to better educate people on the work that we're doing and opportunities for engaging so that we can build resources as well as technologies that meet their needs.
I encourage all of you to send in questions and ideas about and examples of how digital investments are starting to change your communities. And you could also point out ways in which there might be risks of them not expanding opportunity. We definitely want to hear about that too. So we're going to take a quick 5 to 7 minute break, come back for our excellent rural panel where we're going to hear about the nitty gritty of implementation on the ground and what it takes. So please come back and thank you and join me in thanking our panelists today for their excellent insights.
Thank you.
All right, welcome back, everyone. Thank you for sticking around for the last and, of course, the best panel of the day, in my opinion. I'm Corianne Scally. I'm a senior fellow here at the Urban Institute, and it's really been a great conversation so far today, digging into issues around expanding infrastructure, getting people connected to reliably to high-speed internet, and the importance of devices used to do that as well as the basic infrastructure, and of course, digital literacy and ensuring that people know how to use the internet effectively when getting the opportunity to have that better access. And then our last panel talked about the types of outcomes that we might be looking to achieving through expanding this access as well. So we've heard about health, we've heard about education, and we're really excited to continue this conversation with this panel. So some folks have already talked about some of the unique challenges that rural communities face in this space, and really excited to have three panelists here today who can help us explore these themes, not just the challenges, but also opportunities and solutions that can meet the unique needs that rural communities have. So I am joined today by, immediately to my left here, Brian Vo, who is the Chief Investment Officer for Connect Humanity. Next to him is Catherine Krantz, who is the Area Director for broadband for Communities Unlimited. They serve 7 states in the southeastern United States. And then finally at the end, we have Glenn Howie, who is the State Broadband Director in Arkansas in the Department of Commerce there. So the first question really is around implementation. We've heard a lot about different programs and resources that have been made available, particularly in the last few years, and would really love to hear from each of you how implementation is going so far in rural places. So Glenn, I'd love to start with you. Your office has been responsible for developing the plans and proposals that we've been hearing about around digital equity and the distribution of important federal resources. So can you tell us what how the state of Arkansas has been approaching this implementation so far?
Yeah, thank you to the Urban Institute for having me. I think Arkansas has a great story to tell, as Catherine would certainly back me up on that. We just have to tell it, so I'm glad very much to be here. I think before we get to Arkansas specifically, for the room to set the context just a little bit, I think when we think about equity efforts and infrastructure efforts broadly, a lot of the impact on rural America comes down to the state broadband offices themselves. You have 56, right, states and territories plus DC with 56 different broadband offices, varying staff sizes. Louisiana has 3, we have 7 in Arkansas. Wisconsin has 23 on their team. You have varying levels of maturity in the offices. How long have the offices been running grants? Have they been able to learn from past mistakes moving forward? And so there are varying levels and variables as far as how states implement what they do. And so I just want to lay that context out for folks at the outset. Specific to Arkansas, again, great story to tell. We were more of a veteran office. I came into the role in August of 22, so a little over 2 years now, from the Louisiana office with my year there before coming to Arkansas. We were a state that was fortunate to deploy infrastructure grants broadly and early. So post-pandemic, Arkansas utilized CARES dollars for infrastructure grants. We then utilized state and local fiscal recovery fund dollars. We then most recently utilized capital projects fund dollars, moving into the BEAD program. So before Arkansas even gets to BEAD, we've already allocated over $500 million in grants, touching about 130,000 locations, homes, businesses, and community anchor institutions. Moving forward into BEAD, we have about 84,000 or so homes, businesses, and community anchor institutions remaining that, to this day, have no access at all, or the access that they do have is very poor, and they have not been subject to a grant award to date. So about 84,000 locations, an allocation in the BEAD program, $1.024 billion in Arkansas, so one of 19 states in the country to receive an allocation in excess of $1 billion, 9th in the country per capita. So Arkansas is positioned very well moving forward into the BEAD program to hopefully become the first fully connected state in the Southeast.
Is there anything in particularly that you have found effective in thinking about the rural communities in your state and kind of making sure that their unique needs and circumstances are reflected in your programming?
Yeah, it's a very great question. I think, you look at earlier versions of our infrastructure grant program, had specific requirements around certain sizes of communities, for instance, that could apply in the program. In earlier rounds of the program, I believe before I got there, it was 500 or so residents or more, right? That was sort of the baseline bottom restriction on number of folks within that community that could then apply. I think, moving forward into the BEAD program, it's a little different. So in the BEAD program, you have the homes and businesses and community anchor institutions that are eligible for the program, relevant to the speeds and access and prior grant funding or not. And so in BEAD, it's very interesting. If there is a county in Arkansas where the county judge never calls me back, doesn't answer my phone call, the mayor, doesn't like me or whatever, we still have to go and award a grant for every single location in that county, in that community, regardless of community involvement. So I think kind of the older programs, that was a huge necessity, at least on the infrastructure side. Moving forward in infrastructure to BEAD, that's not as big of a play in this particular program, like it or not. Sort of that's how the federal statutes were written on that. Now, on the broader sort of equity or opportunity context, that's much more interesting. One of the things that we tried to do last year, hit all 75 counties, toured the state. We encouraged every county to form a county broadband committee to work in concert with our office, sort of at a grassroots level, to hear from local folks, because local folks know their needs and issues and potential solutions better than myself and my team sitting in chairs in Little Rock, right, and dictating out things. And so we've made a concerted effort to organize at the grassroots level, get them involved, get them energized, and from that, hopefully extrapolate out important broadband priority needs for them at the local level.
That's terrific. It's a great model. Brian, I'd love to turn to you next. At Connect Humanity, you have developed a kind of particular approach to investment and capacity building in rural contexts to try and expand broadband infrastructure specifically. Can you tell us a little bit more about your approach?
Yeah, absolutely. So Connect Humanity is a nonprofit impact investor advancing digital equity. What that means is we'll support communities both on the planning side, how do you get to shovel-ready, investment-ready, but also how do you capitalize the project? Because if you don't have the capital, you might as well not have the plan as well, right? And so I think we've learned three really big lessons. First one was oftentimes our biggest value add is that of translation. Right? When we think about broadband, when we think about finance, federal and state programs, there's a web of jargon, right, that communities need to sift through, when really at the end of the day, they're raising their hands and just saying, we need connectivity. So a lot of the translation we'll try to do is code switch, honestly, from finance speak. What does that mean for your community? Different interest rate levels, or capital from this provider or that provider. What does that technology design mean for your short-term and long-term connectivity? Code switching between the bill of materials when you might see like GPON or XG. What does that mean for your community? So really trying to empower and enable them to make informed decisions. I think the second one is for us, we had to really unpack the word risk. Oftentimes in our investment committee, we would hear, the conversation would be like, oh, that investment sounds too risky. It's like, well, which part of it, right? Is it that it's in a low-income community? Is it that it's in a rural community? Is it that it's in a majority, community of color? Like, let's unpack risk. And so I think in that process, some of the aha moments that we had was, if we think about just the very nature of broadband economics with where bandwidth consumption is going, it's been growing 35% annually. It's going to continue growing 35% annually for the foreseeable future, which means from an investor hat, it's stable and predictable cash flows. That sounds very financeable, right? And so let's be careful with how we're using the word risk. And then I think the last major lesson has really been around how can we use our position as a capital provider to provide really create a seat at the table for community and community voice. I think historically, a lot of networks have been built between investors and ISPs, almost a bilateral conversation, and that allows each to really extract a lot of value. By having a capital provider that says, no, this seat right here is going to be for community, then I think that we can start creating mechanisms that protect community interest as part of that conversation.
That's great. Catherine, you work across a number of rural communities, across 7 different states. As an intermediary organization, what types of decisions are you out there helping rural communities work through when it comes to thinking through their high-speed internet needs and how best to meet those?
Yeah, so it's been such an interesting conversation today, listening to all the different perspectives. And one of the things that I think that I can bring, because of the work that I do, I work for a nonprofit called Communities Unlimited, and we serve communities in 7 states: Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Tennessee. These are some of the least connected states in the nation, with some of the least connected communities in the nation. When you look across all metrics of connectivity, whether it's access, subscription rates, adoption rates, digital literacy, we are some of the communities most in need. Communities Unlimited is a community development organization that's been offering infrastructure technical assistance to communities for 50 years. So this is our absolute expertise, helping communities navigate really complex things. And when it comes to infrastructure, these are very expensive things as well. And we do water, wastewater, drinking water, economic development. Broadband is new for the organization, but I've been working in broadband for about 10 years. And I started out as an economic development planner before there were funds for broadband. We all knew in rural communities, we knew that we had bad internet. We didn't need a pandemic to tell us that. We already knew that our kids were at the library parking lot doing homework. So what we bring as rural broadband advocates is an understanding of the impact that better connectivity can bring. And one of the things that has come up multiple times today that I want to double down a little bit on is capacity building. It's a huge part of the work that we do, education. And it's not fair to say that rural communities or poor communities or small communities have less broadband knowledge. That's really across the board, whether you're talking to a small town mayor or a member of Congress. They don't understand the technology. They don't understand the business model. They don't understand what communities need. And so 90% of what I do every day is education, helping people understand. Most communities know that their internet's bad. They don't know what they can do about it. They don't know, is it a $50,000 problem? Is it a $50 million problem? And usually it's closer to the $50 million. But they just know that they need help. So what we do as an organization, and another thing to keep in mind, when I was an economic development planner, I wanted to be a broadband planner, but there was no money in it. So with the organization that I work for, I was an economic development planner, I was a municipal solid waste planner, I was a transportation planner. So the luxury of being able to focus 100% on broadband is something that the communities we work with don't have. You know, a lot of the communities are even volunteer mayors. They're not even full-time municipal leaders. They definitely aren't professional city administrators. They're dealing with roads, they're dealing with housing, they're dealing with homelessness, they're dealing with a bunch of other things. And I will tell you that if you're not focused 100% on broadband, you're missing out. I mean, I guarantee something really monumental probably happened today while we were sitting here, because that's how it is with broadband. It's big news happens every day. And that's one of the best things I can bring to communities is to know that me and my team, we're on it all day, every day. We're going to keep up with the things that they're going to miss. And that's where one of the things I think Iona mentioned earlier about the capacity and how these communities that most needed it weren't getting the grants because they didn't have the capacity to apply for them. My goodness, that is such a heavy lift for communities. I've written in partnership with communities and internet service providers over 67 grants in the last year, and I am still overwhelmed by the process. These grants come out with 30-day, 60-day windows, and if you haven't already been working on it for 2 years, you're not going to be competitive. So it's a huge lift to ask for these communities. That's where an organization like mine comes in. We help them understand the technology, understand the business model, why some communities have good internet, why some don't, why we haven't fixed it as a nation, although we've been working on it since 2010 and spent, hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions, just in the last few years alone. All those things are really overwhelming for the communities. And another thing I will say, and then I'll wrap it up, because I was like your previous guest, I can talk about this for hours. One of the things that people don't understand when they hear about all these billions of dollars coming, they get excited. 95% of America won't even be eligible for those funds. I mean, what we're talking about is, depending on which data you look at, 2%, 4%, 6% of American households are still unconnected. That's still millions of people, but a small percentage of America. And so everyone's unsatisfied with their internet, whether it's good or bad. They all think that it can be better. And everyone's hearing about this money, and they all want it. And then they don't understand that 95% of communities aren't even eligible. And then they hear about it, think it's a lot of money, think it's going to solve everything. It's not. It's a drop in the bucket. We could spend that $65 billion every 5 years and still justify it with the economic impact and still have plenty of work to do. So managing expectations, I guess, capacity building, managing expectations, education, that's what I do.
Yeah, I think you've all talked about the importance of translation and really being in communication and with folks in the community to make the case and also to build their capacity to ensure that they can get access to what they need. So I appreciate that from all of you. Of course, we know that we need the infrastructure. You need to be able to connect to it. You need the device. But excuse me. But people still need additional supports to be able to use the internet effectively. So I would love to hear from each of you, what you've found to work to kind of build this type of digital knowledge and autonomy in rural communities. And Brian, I would love to start with you. I know you all have developed an approach to ensuring that households are connected and have devices that work for them and that help them use the internet effectively for what they need. So I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So after access is adoption, right? And one of the big barriers to that certainly is affordability, but a lot of device access too. And I think our foundation is really in something I think everybody recognizes, which is broadband creates economic value. The question really then becomes, can we create mechanisms that capture that value rather than release it as an externality? Are there ways where we can keep that value within the community or let it be extracted? And so on a post-access basis, one of the things we've thought about is using device access. Devices as really the linchpin for knowledge and literacy. So instead of granting devices to low-income households, we're structuring a couple transactions where we would provide the funding to an ISP who then gets devices for low-income households. So at the household level, it's a similar impact. But by running it through the ISP, they now stand to gain the value of the monthly subscription. And so we'll say, pay us a portion of that until the balance of the device is repaid. If that household churns, goes to a competitor, stops paying their monthly, ISP is no longer on the hook for the remaining amount of the balance. But now that we're getting a device into that household, could we view that device as a platform for content and service distribution? So pre-flash, telehealth apps to connect with providers, financial literacy content where they can click through and then they have a link to opening an online checking account, links to government services, veteran affairs, et cetera. So making the device and the internet as usable as possible out of the box. And then we're working with community anchors to really distribute that. And on distribution, handing it over, providing the in real-time digital literacy training.
Sounds like a really exciting program. Do you have any outcomes, or what are you thinking about to assess like the successfulness of that approach?
Really, how much is it being used? It's one of those where it's like, it's all digital, so we could get pretty creepy with the data tracking.
Yeah, you could.
At what point does it get too creepy? So that's a constant conversation that we have. But I would say, a small pilot we're trying right now, it's $250K to serve 1,000 households. Of that 250, we're only spending 100, 120 on the devices and the flashing itself. The other amount is really for the community anchors that would be hosting the literacy. In this one case, it's through a library so that they can properly resource the digital literacy program that they'd kind of been doing at a Hyde.
Very cool, very cool. Catherine, I know you've already mentioned you spend a lot of your time talking directly with communities, and that oftentimes there are, of course, real infrastructure barriers, but then also perceived barriers, just perhaps based on experience and history of how the community has interacted with infrastructure and with internet use previously, before all of these new opportunities have opened up. Can you talk to us a little bit about how you work with rural communities to help them understand how the opportunities of tomorrow might be different from the opportunities of yesterday?
Yeah, so that really is a big challenge, because once you get connectivity, which we still struggle in the communities I work with, then you have to get people to sign up. And when internet exists but people do not sign up, excuse me, it's usually because they can't afford it, they don't see the value in it, or they don't know how to use it. And how we address that is through digital inclusion activities, digital literacy, and one of the things that I tell people, we mentioned a little bit earlier today about the rural electrification project. When we brought electricity to every farmhouse in America, there were people like me that went around and convinced farmers that they needed electricity, because in their mind, the electricity was a light bulb. And they got up with the sun, they went to bed with the sun. They didn't need a light to read, because they didn't understand about what was going to come after the light bulb, all the other uses of electricity that would come later. And that's where we're at with broadband right now, is it hasn't been that long that people made that change of thought from thinking of the internet is only for Facebook or only for social media. Now they understand, oh, it's important for jobs, it's important for healthcare, it's important for economic development, but they haven't made that next leap that we don't even know the implications of connectivity on our nation, on our rural communities, because we're not connected yet. And the idea that we have to prepare communities for this future needs that we can't visualize yet. Additionally, I used to get really frustrated in the early days when people would say, rural people don't want internet. We try to sell the internet to people in the country. They don't want it. They don't sign up. And that would frustrate me so much, because if you had to suffer through below 25 megabit internet service, like my family, we were trying to run a business on 1 megabit service, you wouldn't want it either. And so until we improve the connectivity, until we improve the experience, they're not going to be excited about it. And that's just, when you have such slow internet, it's unreliable, goes off half the time. I can tell you about the Super Bowl when we lost internet, like the last 2 minutes of the game. I mean, I'm not even a sports fan, and I yelled at the TV. I mean, that is unacceptable. You have buffering. You have weird problems with your computer and your wireless printer that don't seem to happen at my house. I mean, my mom will call me to fix these problems. I'm like, doesn't happen at my house. Well, that happens if you're less than a 25 megabit environment. So it's a frustrating experience for people. But so you got to figure out the language. What is their pain point? I talked to my mother. She's in her 70s, having better education opportunity for her grandchildren. She spent $2,000, put a tower in the backyard so we could get fixed wireless access. I tell the story about, at that point, every kid in my family was growing up without internet, competing against every other kid getting ready for college. Well, the youngest just graduated from college with a computer science degree. That doesn't happen in a 1 megabit environment. That might not have even happened in a 25 megabit environment. He would have gone on to work for his dad. Now, at 21 years old, he's making almost $80,000 a year. So when I talk about these things, it's really personal. And what you have to do is find the pain point for the people, whether it's education, whether it's job opportunity, and they're not going to be excited about it until it's actually an enjoyable experience. And you do that by meeting them where they're at. You know, public access centers, that's something that Angela Bennett was talking about, the NTIA grant program that just closed that we're so excited about. It has a significant amount of funding for public access centers. Well, that's where people who don't have internet at home can go to get online. And also I've worked with communities in rural Texas where they didn't have good enough connectivity to work remotely, but they would put a hub in the downtown area and people would drive to work remotely. There was a story earlier today about a woman in Mississippi that I think Christopher mentioned. Well, one of the communities I'm working with in Mississippi, there's a woman who's waiting for that. She drives an hour to work at an office because she can't work remotely, and she's the only one that works in that office, and they want to close that office. But until she gets better internet, she can't work from home. So you have to figure out the pain point, and you have to understand what the obstacle is. And also, I'll just throw in here really quickly, the adoption rates, they have to be better. You know, until we get people to subscribe to the internet, they're not going to be sustainable networks. And that's a problem too, is that if the internet service providers don't see an interest, they don't have a justification to invest the millions of dollars, because understand that these environments, if it was easy, if it was profitable, would have been done already. The communities that are left are difficult, not profitable, barely sustainable. And the only way we can make it sustainable is to have higher subscription rates. So we really have to encourage people to understand the value of it, or they're going to disappear. The grant's going to run out. The network's going to disappear. We're going to be back right where we were. So it's essential work to get people to sign up.
Yeah. Glenn, can you tell us a little bit about the types of investments in the state of Arkansas that you have been making in the digital literacy space, and kind of some of the barriers and opportunities you've found to work in your rural communities?
Yeah, thank you. It's, you know, our team would estimate there's about 300,000 Arkansans in the traditional working age bracket of 18 to 64 that lack basic digital skills, okay? We're not talking about coding or creating websites. I'm saying take the mouse, go to Google, apply for a job, right? This is a very complicated issue. You take stats like that, and on top of that, say that, you know, some of the data collection that the team has worked on, about 1 in 10, I don't know if I can say Americans, they may not extrapolate to the whole country, but 1 in 10 Arkansans, only 1 in 10 Arkansans were actually interested in attending an in-person digital skills class, right, and training session. So it's a very complicated, very nuanced issue. So looking forward, one of the things that we're trying to do when we roll out our digital skills curriculum and programming statewide across the state, utilizing the Digital Equity Capacity Grant Program, you know, has to be an online option, right? So it's not just, oh, we're going to set up training in these centers and have people come by and have the preacher motivate everyone on Sunday to go. No, there has to be an online component as well to this. That's one of the things that we're looking at and hoping to roll out shortly there. We're also going to work to connect CAIs, right, that don't have public access Wi-Fi. We're going to work on that issue. We're going to work on connecting MDUs to access for those folks as well. I think, again, coming back to 300,000 folks between 18 and 64, which doesn't count anyone over, right, older than 64 or younger than 18, but the fact that only 1 in 10, right, are interested in attending something in person, I think it's a huge problem that doesn't get mentioned enough in these panels, and that's something that we have to continue to try to work through.
I'd like to remind everyone in the audience here and online to use the Q&A box or scan the code and put in your questions for our panelists. We're going to turn to audience questions in just a minute. So the last question that I have for you all to consider and quickly respond to is to get back to what we've been asking everyone around defining digital equity and measuring progress. So how are you defining and measuring digital equity for the rural communities that you're working with? then how will you know that you've succeeded in achieving this through your work? And we can just go right down the line. Happy to start with you, Brian.
Yeah, I would say three things there. I think from a short-term perspective, communities take a leadership role and can own how their networks are being designed and operated. And so there's meaningful input, not just here's a letter of support to go along with your grant application, but really, no, this is an important anchor over here or an important community center or church. It needs to, the network needs to run through here. And it needs to have these level of affordability packages. And so one of the things we've thought a lot about is what we call digital equity covenants, where just like a lender might have financial covenants of what you can and can't do with the money, can digital equity covenants guide or guard what ISPs do, and if they do what they say they'll do. I think from a long-term perspective, can we use mechanisms like that to really have teeth and to ensure, 5-7 years from now, knowing that there's going to be a big wave of consolidation in the telco industry, particularly with all this fiber that's being built, that what we saw in the short term, communities really leaning in and saying, here's, I own this network, that also happens in the long run, also known as sustainability in some version. I think the third thing is we know it's not enough money, right? And so beyond relying on BEAD 2 or whenever something like that might come, we know deployment, it's going to be insufficient. But beyond deployment, there's going to be maintenance. There's going to be upgrades. And so really, can we catalyze or mobilize an additional capital market that's geared towards broadband? Very similar to how community finance oriented itself around affordable housing and really helped proliferate that through CDFI, CRA, tax credits. Can we have learn a parallel lesson to create a similar type of capital market for broadband serving low-income areas?
Yeah, thank you. Catherine?
Yeah, I think that's so important to look at it that way. Beyond the really obvious metric of connecting communities and seeing higher subscription rates, I think that this industry, as long as I've been working on it, has been a real series of these monumental climbs, these big mountains. And I think, to Brian's point and what we've been hearing a lot, throwing out there what my personal goal is to see some progress on this is a greater understanding at the policy level of how that this is not ever going to be a one and done. No matter what amount of funding you throw at it, this needs to be a consistent investment in whatever it takes to connect our nation, whatever it takes to prepare our nation for the technological needs of the future. And we just have to figure it out, whether it's programs like that, whether it's other funding programs. This short-sightedness is what worries me. This idea that we could create an ACP program and then not fund it again. The idea that people that make these decisions still think that you can invest money in infrastructure once and never again. Our technology needs will never be less than they are now. So we're going to have a consistent long-term commitment. And that's what I'd like to see.
Mm-hmm. Glenn, how about you? How are you defining things and what are you measuring to improve your success in this area?
I joke with folks back home, and I always say that I'm the only person in Arkansas state government whose job it is to work himself out of a job. There's locations that will never be profitable, no matter what you do. It's going to take $10 million to connect that one guy on top of the mountain in the Ozarks, and he may not even subscribe if you build it to him, right? And so holistically moving forward, I don't think that there is a point in time when we say, okay, it's successful now. It's a continuous iteration that goes on and on and on. And Catherine's right, there will need to be some level of continuous funding. For instance, in our office, we're fully federally funded. There are no state funds for our team. And so once BEAD funds are gone in about probably 5 or 6 years, the states are going to have to decide, okay, are we going to step up and invest in this thing moving forward? So that's something to think about as well. But no, ultimately, in short, I don't think there's a certain point when we say, okay, great, everyone go home.
So I hear a lot of positivity around progress and expecting that to happen over the next few years, but maybe some concerns about starting to think now about how to sustain access in rural communities over the long run. Thank you for that. Reminder, please continue to submit your questions. We have a couple of good ones from the audience coming in. And then I also thought of one based on some earlier conversations around and statistics shared around the lack of access for Indigenous people and communities. I think that's the case in both urban and rural contexts. And was curious if any of you are working with the Native communities in the work that you do, and if there are any particular obstacles and solutions that you're finding in expanding infrastructure to particularly on tribal lands, but also just reaching Indigenous
So you'd have
people.
experience in that with Oklahoma, yeah. Well, we don't have any in Arkansas.
Okay. So we do work in Oklahoma, and we also have Native partnerships in Mississippi as well. So one thing to understand is that in Native communities, they have a lot greater challenges for broadband connectivity. They are their own country, so they have different requirements, different laws. It's not as easy to come up with simple solutions. And one of the things that I have worked with very few personally, but in our service area, other parts of our organization have worked really closely. I'm about 15 minutes away from the Choctaw Nation, and I spent some time recently with their broadband director. And one of the most important things is to understand that every community and every culture has their own needs, and not assume that what we think of as the solution is actually the best for them. And so they have their own priorities. They have their own organizations that are experts in broadband. They have their own understanding, and it's better to let them lead on that. Traditionally, they have struggled a lot more with connectivity, as all rural, under-resourced communities have. So it's important to bring them into the conversation. I know that that has been a challenge because there are additional funding programs available, and sometimes people see that as an opportunity and they jump in. But generally, Native communities have their own experts and their own priorities.
It's an important reminder for us all. Thank you. Did anybody else want to add on to that?
Yeah, just briefly, I mean, Arkansas, we technically don't have any federally recognized tribes in the state. We do have, I believe, the nation's largest residential communities of Marshallese in the country are based in Arkansas. And so, as Catherine said, it just takes extra care and extra touch, and understanding those trusted voices on the ground. You have to make sure that you engage with those folks and they come to the table, because it can make a difference whether I'm there, right, saying a particular thing, or if someone else who's more trusted in the community can voice for them as well. So it's just taking extra care and understanding when engaging with whether it's Native tribes or other minority groups.
Yeah, other cultures, and just being culturally respectful and making sure you're using the right lens. Yeah. We have another question around that some of you may be able to speak to, kind of the importance of digital access programs that address entrepreneurship in underserved and disadvantaged communities, where, particularly I think in rural places where entrepreneurship is often a very accessible avenue to financial security and empowerment. And I'm not sure if you all have worked with communities or used that in your case-making approach in terms of, being able to grow local entrepreneurship and businesses through expanded infrastructure and connectivity. Anybody want to speak to that?
I think, briefly, kind of in that vein, it's like $1 of broadband infrastructure investment will realize $4 of gain in this process, right? So that's a great multiplier, 4 times. They're an example of impacting at least small business, right? There's a lovely pie shop that's in a very small community outside of Little Rock to the east. And prior to a recent infrastructure project going in, right, the local shop didn't take cards, right? It was cash only. And so people would come in and tourists would come visit because they're really well known in the state, but then, you know, only accepting cash, right? There's just a small example where I know sometimes we want to be innovative and think, you know, entrepreneurship and driving these cool, innovative ideas and concepts when really some of the most impactful things that can happen are to everyday folks that are already there, and is simply taking a card, right, for your business can impact the community. And so I think sometimes we have to remember the basics in this stuff. This can get really exciting. The BEAD program is a $42.5 billion program out of the 65 in IJA. I know that we want to be innovative and have new programs. Sometimes you don't necessarily need a new program, whether it's telehealth or precision ag or education. Programs are already there, but the utilization is not there, right? So sometimes you need a new program, sometimes you don't. You just have to drive people to what's already there. And I think sometimes returning the conversation to the very basics of what we're doing is important.
And I will say, too, since Glenn doesn't brag about himself enough, that Arkansas has done some really great work around that. And one of the things that your state plan addresses is the impact of small businesses on infrastructure investment. And Communities Unlimited, I only do broadband, but we have several other programs. One of them is about entrepreneurship. We do lending, we're a CDFI, and we do a lot of work with small businesses, and we have a lot of statistics that show even a small amount of connectivity will increase earnings. I think something like more likely to have hired employees recently if you have a website, a certain percentage of increase in gains. And then across the state level, there's not enough data, which this is something to put a shout out there with all these communities getting connected that have not been connected before. We anticipate seeing some dramatic increases in economic impact and economic results. But the data that we have up until now shows incredible, it's very expensive, but it pays for itself exponentially in the amount of economic impact, job creation, and positive.
Like wages and.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
As an investor, we actually bake it into our underwriting. So we'll put it under the broad banner of community engagement. And it's fascinating to see how different ISPs will respond. On the one end, it'll be like, oh, I don't think it's a good use of my time to do town hall presentations. It's like, oh, that's your definition of community engagement? All the way to the other end of the spectrum where it's like, no, we've engaged these groups. We're going to create this affordable package with the always-on option. And all of our packages will be symmetrical. We're also working with the local trade school to have to train up some splicers because we need them to run the business, and it's best if they're local, and everything in between. And so wherever folks end up on that spectrum, often there's a direct correlation, if not a causation, with the investment outcome. So that's one where, you know, the financial and the impact side of it are closely related for us.
Wonderful. I would like to invite everyone to thank our panelists. Really just great to learn from you all and the work that you're doing on the ground. Thank you so much for being with us. And before we wrap up today, if you've been with us for the event, you know we've been posting some reflection questions along the way. So we would like to continue to ask everyone in the audience here and online to help everyone who's spoken here today, everyone who's participated, think about where we should be going next. So would love for you to take a moment to write down some answers to the questions that we've been sharing throughout our time together. And you can either do that by jotting down some notes in that Q&A box for us. We'll be continuing to collect those. You can also, of course, share your ideas on social media with us, and then also we'll be sharing the code for the post-event survey. It's another opportunity for you all to share your thoughts on these questions. So the ones that we've asked so far are: how should policymakers and researchers monitor progress toward making broadband more affordable, available, and usable? So that was our first reflection question from earlier. The second is, how are you seeing digital investments change your communities in ways that expand opportunity? And then this final question that you see on the screen now is if your community does not feel ready at this time to put the different funds and programs we've been talking about today to optimal use, what additional information, guidance, or support would feel helpful to you? So please take the time to, again, share your answers with us in that Q&A box on social media or via the post-event survey that we hope everyone will fill out. As Kim said at the beginning, your responses to the survey really give us great feedback and let us know how to shape our future programming to support your needs. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining today.
Thank you.